After the Chinese and Canadian teams in a short track skating event at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics were disqualified for impeding the Korean team, I'll be asking whether the rules of this particular sport are in urgent need of upgrading. And as lecturers in British universities start strike action over changes in their pension scheme, how will it affect the students themselves and what can they do about it? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xu. The short track women's 3,000-meter relay final at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics ended up with quite a number of unexpected outcomes. The Republic of Korea, who is the host, won the gold medal. Referees penalized the Chinese and the Canadians, who finished second and third respectively, giving the Italians, who finished fourth, the silver medal, and the Dutch, who won a final B group, the bronze. The International Skating Union, or ISU, confirmed its penalty imposed on Chinese athletes, claiming the Chinese short trackers had and I quote, skated from the outside to the inside of the track, impeding the Korean skater, in its official statement. However, both Chinese athletes and sports fans were left frustrated and confused about the penalty, as they believe the referees were not being fair. So how should we look at this event, which has rather a history of controversy, and are the rules too outdated to keep up with the sport itself? Joining me for the discussion are from Boston, Song-Yun Lee, Assistant Professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and in Beijing we have Victor Gao, Global Counselor of the Asia Society. But first, we're going to cross over to Greg Lafradi, who is host of Sports Scene on CGTN in Pyeongchang. Greg, it's good to have you with us. But before I ask you my first question, I would really like to introduce this piece of soundbite from Li Yan, who is the chief coach of the Chinese sports track speed skating team. This is what she had to say after the penalty was given out.
We wrote a protest to the ISU technical committee. Just want to ask them if in one race they should have consistency call.
There you go. So, Greg, having heard what Li Yan said about the importance of consistency in the referee's judgment, do you think consistency really can be achieved during such a highly charged game?
Consistency is very difficult any time it's based on people's decisions. The referees are privy to video replays and the best technology that they can offer to make these split-second judgments, but it's very difficult. They have time and they have a small committee of assistant referees that they can refer to discuss it, but apparently it is very, very difficult. I am certainly not nearly as qualified as Li Yan or as experienced in the sport to make a determination like this. I was there at the race as well, watching it happen. And I was just as confused as everybody else in the stands. Now, that being said, as for consistency, the ISU does their best to choose a selection of referees from a variety of countries to make sure that there is no bias. We saw also in the short track at these Olympic Games, we saw South Korea. 2 South Korean skaters were penalized and disqualified from their events. Che Min-jong finished second in the women's 500 meters. She was later disqualified. The world record holder in the ladies 1,000 meter, Shim Soo-ki, was also penalized and disqualified from hers. Now, some of these may be more obvious calls than what we saw in the 3,000 meter relay, but the very nature of the 3,000 meter relay is even more unpredictable because there are simply so many skaters on the track at the same time. So consistency is always going to be a benchmark that we strive for, but achieving it and setting it is going to be very, very difficult.
Right. You're Canadian, and the Canadian athletes have also been penalized. How are they taking this story? How are they feeling about this penalty?
Well, right after the event, I was in the mixed press zone to listen to both the Chinese athletes speaking about the situation and the Canadians. The underlying message from both teams was that they realized there was some bumps, some contact, which again is part of the nature of short track speed skating, yet both teams were unclear and unaware with exactly what they were being penalized for. Both China and Canada wanted further clarification and felt that it was not coming at the time. These experienced athletes were even a little bit confused, so the rest of us also not sure what was going on and waiting for further clarification that did not come immediately.
Now, the Chinese team launched an appeal. Is there any way for this decision to be overturned? I understand that the ISU said the 30-minute time limit for launching such a complaint has been expired when the appeal was launched. Are you convinced by that explanation?
Well, absolutely. These are standards set by the ISU. There are numerous short track races at the Olympics and then even more throughout each season. The Olympics, which of course come around every 4 years, but all of the people involved, from the coach of the Chinese team, Li Yan, to all of the other teams involved, are very much aware of the rules. Somebody of Li Yan's caliber knows these standards, knows these rules. They know the time they have to act within it. So it wasn't something that was sprung on them, this 30-minute window, and if neither team failed to act within that time, I think the ISU is right to enforce that. That is not an arbitrary rule. It's something that exists and they would have known beforehand. So while it's very disappointing to hear that something as simple as not filing paperwork on time is part of the factor for that, these standards have to be upheld, or else we'll have no standards within the sport.
Well, Li Yan's explanation for the delay in filing the complaint is that when she was filing the complaint, nobody was present to receive it because they were in a meeting. Anyway, very limited time. We have to leave it there with Greg Lafrati, host of Sports Scene on CGTN. I would like to come to our guests in the studio. Victor, how are the Chinese athletes and sports fans feeling so frustrated and confused about the penalty, understanding that, you have to accept the rules of the game?
Well, I think for the Chinese athletes, for this game, as well as for the Chinese audience throughout the country, the outcome, which means the disqualification of the Chinese team, came as a big surprise, and it really caused a lot of frustration to the Chinese viewers in their hundreds of millions. And I think given the fact that the space involved for the event is relatively speaking very small, and the number of athletes competing were very many, for example, and the speed involved is so fast that bumping into each other is probably part of the game itself. And to disqualify the Chinese team and the Canadian team is really a very, very harsh punishment to start with, and to disallow the Chinese team to make the complaint, to review the case, etc., really makes the situation much worse. Now that the game is over, I think we most likely need to look forward rather than being played down by this very tragic event.
Do you think the Chinese public have been overreacting because they have had this kind of a sense of frustration or mistrust, let's say, as a result of an extended period of coldness between these two countries politically? Do you think there's also the aftermath of that?
Yeah. According to media reports, I think it's not just the Chinese audience or the Chinese team which have felt frustrated by the conduct of the referees. Other countries, for example, the Canadian teams, also felt very much disappointed by the judgments or the decisions by some of the referees during the game. So I think the referees also need to really improve their standards in making their decisions. For the Chinese audience, of course, the great disappointment happened when the Chinese team failed to get any single medal by the time of this women's relay competition, and they were really expecting that the Chinese women's team would really deliver a medal, or even better, a gold medal, and this failure came as a great shock and great disappointment for the Chinese audience.
Right. Professor Li, how do you look at the impact of the controversy over the sports on bilateral ties between China and ROK? It seems there is a backlash within the Chinese public against the Koreans because of what they perceive as controversial results of unfair treatment.
I'm not a sports analyst, but the only consistency I can see in all of this is that whenever you have judges, referees involved, and that would the most sporting events, there will always be inconsistency, frustration, sense of grievance. And I can certainly understand that the Chinese athletes and the Canadians and their supporters are very unhappy. At the same time, when you exercise some logic, I think much of the thrust of the grievance directed at South Korea and the implication that the South Koreans had perhaps even gotten favorable treatment, or perhaps there was some shady deals between the South Koreans and the judges, all that is very much misplaced because South Korea came in before China. So I can understand that the Chinese team is very unhappy that they were deprived of the silver medal, whereas if China had come in before, crossed the finish line before South Korea and been stripped of the gold medal, and the gold medal thereby was awarded to the South Korean team, then I think this kind of frustration and strong anger would be perhaps even more justified. At the same time, whenever you have these sports events at a high profile at the world's biggest stage like the Olympic Games, every time you see this kind of controversy. South Koreans went through it in 2002 when a great American speed skater, Apollo Anton Ono, to South Korean eyes at least, exaggerated a very little maneuver without any contact by a South Korean who came in first, and then he was deprived of the gold medal, Kim Dong-sung, who was one of the greatest speed skaters in history, and Mr. Ono was awarded the gold medal, and he got death threats from South Korean fans. This just didn't die down for weeks and months in South Korea. So I think when you see the political dimensions of international sports events, you see a lot of frustration wrapped up in ethnic nationalism, pride, and that's what we're seeing now, I would say.
Victor, do you agree? This is what we're seeing, a reflection of a sense of nationalism and heightened pride on the part of the Chinese.
Yes, this is very possible, and I think given the nature of the short track fast speeding and given the nature of this particular sport event, it's more natural for people who feel grievance, and when they see their athletes fail to get a medal or receive unfair judgment from the referees. But I hope eventually we can calm down and we can look forward to the next Winter Olympics 4 years later in Beijing, and hopefully by then the Chinese athletes can perform better and can really give more convincing performance and to deserve the gold medals.
Of course, in an ideal circumstance, this would be the case. However, Chinese athlete Wu Dajing, who won China's first gold medal by breaking the world record in the short track men's 500 meter on Thursday, he said after the game that he didn't want to create any opportunity for his competitors and referees. He didn't finish the sentence, but basically what he was implying was that there is certain understanding or belief among the Chinese athletes even that the referees might not have been fair. I would assume that being athletes, they would have seen enough evidence to support that kind of belief. Victor, what has to be done, do you think, to address such mistrust between athletes during these games?
No, I think, allow me to make a radical proposal. I think given the nature of the short track fast speeding, maybe they need to change the way the game will take place. For example, rather than allowing all these different teams to compete at the same time, creating all the possibilities of bumping into each other, they probably can allow one team to compete at a time, followed with another team.
Well, then they will not be so interesting anymore, maybe.
Yes, we may lose out on some of the excitement.
Right,
however, it may make the game much fairer and much more comfortable eventually for people to receive the final judgment.
I understand, but it's definitely a very difficult balance, and I think the discussion will be going on. We're running out of time, unfortunately. Many thanks to my two guests, Victor Gao, Global Counselor of the Asia Society, and Professor Sung Yun Lee at Fletcher School at Tufts University. And here is my point. It is true that among the Chinese public there is quite some frustration that Chinese athletes have been so often disqualified, while their ROK counterparts appear to have had more favorable treatment. What happened in the past has also partly reinforced that frustration. I quite understand it, while feeling sorry for the athletes who will go home empty-handed. What the Chinese athletes have to do now is to accept the final judgments after trying their best to appeal, however unfair they might appear to be, and prepare harder for the next encounter. I believe a stronger team will eventually be rewarded. You're watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us. An unprecedented level of strikes over proposed changes to lecturers' pensions started in 61 universities across the UK on Thursday, and more than 1 million students could be affected by 14 days of action spread over 4 weeks. Institutions affected include some of UK's most prestigious universities, include Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, Durham and Imperial College of London. Already, thousands of university students who have to pay over £9,000 or some $13,000 a year in tuition fees have called for compensation for the loss of teaching hours from the upcoming strikes. Now, the union has issued fresh warnings that the walkouts could continue well into July, into the exam period, if no solution is found. So what's behind this latest row, and what will be the knock-on effect if the action continues? Joining me for the discussion are Dr. Paul Bagley, a lecturer at the School of Sociology and Social Policy in the University of Leeds, and political commentator Charlie Wolfe in London. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Dr. Bagley, could you briefly outline for us the background to this action, to this strike action? Why are the lecturers' pensions being changed, and why has it become such a contentious issue?
They're being changed because the investments over the years have not performed as planned. And this is the third time that the pension benefits have been reduced in about 6 or 7 years. And the pensions are now really will be totally exposed to the performance of the stock exchange. And I think it's that uncertainty and the apparent reduction that many lecturers will face of about £10,000 in their final pension. The story goes back a long way. There are many people who think that the pension fund has been mismanaged over a very long period of time. So, for example, the Financial Times 12, 15 years ago was raising really quite serious questions about how this pension fund was being managed and whether or not the liabilities, that is, what the pension fund can afford to pay, were really being properly estimated, and whether or not the correct investment strategy was being pursued.
Well, Mr. Wolfe, let me ask you this. Is this problem symptomatic of the British pension schemes as a whole, or is academia a special case in point?
Well, I was just reading a study from the Institute for Economic Affairs, and it seems that state sector pensions are the problem. The private pensions seem to do much better. Obviously, pensions go up and they go down, and the risk is what it will be doing when you get to your age of retirement. But I think also what's got the hackles up of many of the professors and the academics is the fact that the people managing the fund, or several at least, have got a couple of pay rises. But you know, if you want the quality of the talent, you have to pay for it.
Dr. Bagley, a university's UK spokesman, said the university's pension scheme has a deficit of £6 billion, and the cost of future pensions benefits has increased by 1/3 since 2014. To maintain current benefits, overall contributions would have to increase by approximately £1 billion every year. Is this telling of bad management of the scheme, or is it down to problems beyond people's control?
I think it could be a mixture of both. The longer-term management.
Dr. Bagley, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. It is partly, I think, to do with the long-run management of the scheme, which goes back 20 years or more. There is also a question over the legal regulation of pensions, which prescribes a very precise and conservative way of calculating whether or not a fund is in surplus or deficit. And the figures are continually debated and contested, not least by the Lecturers' Union, UCU, who have their own kind of financial advisors who come up, with different figures. And I think another point to make clear is that the pension scheme for lecturers is in fact a private scheme. It is not part of the public sector. Half of the universities in Britain are part of this private scheme, and the other half, which are not on strike, are part of a state scheme, which is the same as ordinary school teachers in Britain. So just to reiterate, this is a private scheme, and it has been, in a sense, a state of failure for at least 10 years or more.
Now, Dr. Bagley, once again, already thousands of university students have called for compensation for the loss of teaching hours from the upcoming strikes. How likely is that to happen?
I think it will be very interesting to see how that plays out, whether or not it is really unclear whether or not universities will refund fees straight away. They will certainly be saving some money because lecturers will not be paid on the strike days. And it may well be that the universities try and hold out, and then I think the students will have to pursue the universities through the courts, which would actually take quite a bit longer to achieve some kind of resolution.
Well, many thanks to Dr. Paul Bagley, a lecturer at the School of Sociology and Social Policy in the University of Leeds. And Mr. Wolf, let me ask you this question then. What do you think of the students' demand to get compensation for the hours they might lose? Do you think they have a legal case there?
I have to agree with your other guest. It's kind of unsure how I would go on that one. I could see the case on both sides. They are joining in, many of the students, with the academics on the strike. So to me, that would be like missing class back from my days of going to university. So I think there you may have a problem in trying to reclaim. But ultimately, I think that's my main concern, is strikes in the public sector or by teachers, as in this case, ultimately hurts the consumer, or in this case the students, and especially in this case where you have students who are maybe preparing for dissertations or final exams, etc., who will not receive the education that they need or the help that they need to prepare for final exams. And I think that's something that, obviously you want to see someone have the best pension possible or the best pay possible, but ultimately you also want to think about young people that are starting out in life and wanting to have the best education and the best grades and the best qualifications they can get.
Is there any possibility that some kind of compensation could be provided for these students, given that they have already paid for their tuition fees, and for something that is not within their control or not their fault, that they are suffering some kind of loss?
It's kind of hard for me to view when I remember what my parents paid when I went to university in the States. I think I would have considered $13,000 quite a deal. Maybe would have paid for my partying just for 1 year of schooling, to be quite honest. But again, they are seeming to back the professors and academics. They seem to be joining in on the strike, so it's almost as if they were striking themselves. So I think that's, if I was defending from the standpoint of the universities, I think that's the line I would probably take. But again, it is a shame all around.
What about the foreign students studying in the UK, and what about those students who are not with the kind of students that you just mentioned, who are with the professors? They have, for instance, they might have borrowed money to go to school in the UK, and because of the strike they have to miss quite a number of classes. What do you think of that? And obviously I think they usually pay a higher tuition fee as well. There, I think possibly, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a judge, but possibly I could see at least there's more of a presentation of a case for injustice. So there, possibly, I think they have a better chance. What do you think would be the longer-term picture of this kind of action? Do you see this kind of strikes possibly repeating itself in the future if they get what they want, or more of this kind, or this kind of negotiations could be taken? Some kind of negotiations may be taking place to solve this kind of problem before people really go on strike.
Unfortunately, looking again as an American living here in the United Kingdom, I've always seen a lot of power within the unions, or I should say not so much power, but activism by the unions. We seem to be famous for our strikes. And again, not to lay claim against the academics, but you've had very ugly strikes in the past. And again, I separate these academics. But it seems that that's how is a very union-oriented situation. There's a feeling of what is the other guy getting that I'm not getting? For instance, as I mentioned before, the man who's heading up the pension scheme has just got a pay rise. I believe it was some £80,000, which may seem like a lot of money, and it is, but for people who are running funds, that's about what they normally would get paid. That's a crucial job, and I think that's got some form of the hackles, I should say, of the academics up when they see the sort of money they're making concerning or compared to what the man who's managing the money is made. But again, that's the field they chose to get into, and that's the field he chose to get into, and you live with your choices.
Do you think, finally, there could be a backlash of foreign students potentially opting not to go to the UK to continue their studies, but instead heading to other countries?
That's possible. That is possible. I hope not. I think this is a wonderful place to study. I have friends who are academics, especially in the field of economics. And, it's a vibrant, London especially, Oxford, Cambridge are vibrant communities and great places to meet people with diverse ideas and views. And so, again, I would hate to see that happen. And as I said before, these sort of strikes is put out as academics may feel they are, and possibly, rightly possibly are. Ultimately, this is still hurting the students, and that is the real shame of the situation.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guest, political commentator Charlie Wolf, joining us from London. And that is it for this edition of The Point with Li Xin. Follow me on Facebook or Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.